Hey everyone, thank you all for coming out. I want to say thanks to Baltimore UnderGround Science Space for having me as well. Yeah, this is an area that I've been working on for some time now, and it's near and dear to my heart, and I'm guessing it's of interest to you all as well, so it's great to see everybody out here. You know, it's pretty cool because our lab is actually right here. When I was standing on these stairs, I can literally see where we do our work, which is just down the road from here at the Bayview campus. So it's nice to be able to share this with our community, because usually we go out to scientific conferences and you know, we present in those types of venues, so this is a little bit different. Let's talk about psychedelics, and I'm really going to focus on psilocybin because that's the area that our lab has been focusing on for the last 20 years or so. I've been there for about 7 years myself, so a lot of this work I'm going to be presenting is not stuff that I did myself, but I showed up after the fact, or I helped with when I got there. Also, just as a caveat, whatever I say tonight is kind of, you know, presenting the scientific findings, but also those are my, you know, personal take or interpretation of these things. Often, I don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the folks that work in my lab or Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So I'm going to be talking about hallucinogens kind of broadly, and hallucinogens is actually a big class of drugs. There's a lot of different drugs that fall under that umbrella, and psychedelics are a subclass, if you will. And psychedelics are kind of it's a fuzzy term actually, because it was invented in 1957. I'll explain a little bit more about that, but the psychedelics that I'm specifically, I think I just turned it on, sorry. There you go. The psychedelics that I'm specifically going to be talking about are these right here, psilocybin, LSD, and dimethyltryptamine. So they're very specific, and the reason why is because they work on this serotonin 2A or 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A receptor. That seems to be, if you kind of isolate the way that these drugs work, the place where magic happens. And so that's kind of what really differentiates these psychedelics from even MDMA, which work on more broader monoamine neurotransmitter systems, and these dissociatives like ketamine. You probably heard a lot about ketamine. It's been in use since March. It was just approved as an FDA medication for depression. And then, of course, there's been a lot of interest in ibogaine. There's all these other types of dissociatives and deliriums and what have you that are under the class of hallucinogens. But again, I'll be focusing on these classic psychedelics, as we like to call them. And you know, they mostly kind of fall under this rubric of the psilocin, which is psilocybin is broken down into psilocin in the body. So this is basically psilocybin. DMT, which actually already exists in your brain right now. It's already there. Mescaline and LSD. Mescaline comes from cactus. Peyote, actually a few different kinds of cacti. Psilocybin or psilocin comes from mushrooms. And DMT actually is in lots of plants and animals and us. And LSD is actually very interesting. I'll talk a little more about it. But it was synthesized, so it's what we call semi-synthetic, because it came from this great fungus, this kind of fungus that grows on a rock, and they kind of took these molecules to try to make a new drug, and they did. This was a long time ago in the 30s, and LSD was it. And so I'll explain more. But if you look at this kind of structure of these drugs, they're very similar to serotonin. Major neurotransmitter, it's in all our brains. Also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine. And there's specifically this, what they call pyral structure, which is this 6-sided ring with this 5-sided ring next to it. You can see it, it's in most of these guys here. And not necessarily in this one, but this one's a little bit more like a amphetamine. So, anyways, not to get too carried away with the chemistry, but again, I'll be focusing on psilocybin, which comes from, actually it's closer to 200 different species of mushrooms that grow all over the planet. I'm pretty sure the only place it doesn't grow is Antarctica. And so these mushrooms grow and they produce this chemical psilocybin. And if you eat the mushrooms, the body breaks down psilocybin into psilocin, and then that creates these psychedelic types of effects. So the word psychedelic, like I said, is neologism. It's a new word. It was made in 1957 by this guy right here, Humphrey Osmond. he's actually a really kind of underplayed pioneer of the movement. He is a British psychiatrist. He worked in Saskatchewan, Canada for years. He did some of the seminal research using psychedelics therapeutically back in the 50s and 60s. And this is Aldous Huxley. Huxley was a leading intellectual and writer of the middle 20th century, and he wrote stuff like Brave New World, which you might be familiar with. He also wrote an interesting book called The Doors of Perception, where he basically took mescaline, which is a psychedelic, and then wrote about his experience. And so he got super interested in this area, contacted Humphrey Osmond, and they had, they became friends and had a back and forth. And in that, they were trying to figure out how to call these drugs, because at the time, they were being called psychotomimetics, which means that they mimic the psychotic type of experience. They were called fantastica, they were called hallucinogens, but none of those terms really seemed to fit to these guys. And so Humphrey Osmond came up with the word psychedelic. It's coming from these two Greek words, psyche and delos, which basically means mind or soul, and manifesting or revealing. And so the idea was that to them, what these drugs did was kind of help reveal or manifest what was in our mind or in our soul. So it's already starting off from kind of an unusual standpoint if you think about it scientifically. But if you look at what these drugs are known for, is that they actually don't cause physical addiction, so you can't really get addicted to them in the way that you can most of the other drugs that we know about. They're non-toxic, so they don't cause these physiological disturbances that you would get from, again, lots of other types of drugs. But they do cause what this is Dr. Lester Greenspoon. He's a Harvard psychiatrist, a big name in the field. And so this is an older definition of his, said that they produce these thought, mood, and perceptual changes that are rare, except for when we're talking about dreams, contemplative religious exaltation, or psychoses. So the kind of experiences that people have under the influence of these drugs, this is the closest that we know of outside of that. Dreams, psychoses, and religious ecstasy, if you will. This is an interesting paper written by David Nutt and a bunch of other leading pharmacologists, drug experts. And basically what they were trying to do is classify the amount of harm that's known to be associated with different types of drug use. And so mushrooms, this is psilocybin down here at the bottom, are, again, non-toxic. They don't really cause all that much damage in a physiological sense. They have a little bit of risk if you're taking them. First of all, if you're taking mushrooms and you don't know what they are, they can be dangerous. But also, if you take too much, or you're in an unsafe place, or you have some sort of psychiatric or psychological vulnerability, it could be problematic. But you can see pure alcohol, which is obviously very easily accessible, is one of the more harmful substances according to these drug experts. So it's just to give you some context.
What was the scale of that graph? I assume that's not percentages.
No, so this was something that, and they actually wrote an entire paper about how they came to these conclusions and scoring stuff. But basically they had a group of, I think it was about 24 drug experts, medical doctors, pharmacologists, and basically they were voting, and what you can see here is this blue part is how much harm to others, like, I got drunk and, ran somebody over, or how much harm to self, like it's liver damage, these drugs cause. And so this is kind of what they ended up with after they all had this meeting. And wanted to say, if you all have questions, please jump in. I'm going to try to get through a lot of information, so we'll definitely do questions at the end, but if there's something that's burning, just let me know. So kind of going back, there's kind of roughly 3 periods that I like to break down psychedelic use into. And the first is just indigenous use. So indigenous people have been using these kinds of substances for hundreds, thousands of years, really thousands of years. And so the Aztecs, for instance, call these psilocybin-containing mushrooms teonanacatl, which roughly translates to divine flesh. So already in their mind, this had some sort of spiritual significance to them. And this is not just psilocybin, but also ayahuasca is and admixture has been used in South America for at least decades, probably centuries. Again, we talk about mescaline coming from the peyote cactus and from San Pedro cactus. So it has some spiritual significance in a lot of different indigenous cultures that use these types of drugs, going back, way back. There were some...
I'd heard some rumor or some theory that the Vikings used psychedelics to do their berserk raids or some kind of...
I read that as well. I don't know too much about it, but I've read that there's some sort of use among the sort of Nordic peoples, so I think that that's something I don't really know too much about.
Do you know where geographically these indigenous cultures were? Like, would it be Central America?
For psilocybin?
Yeah. Or
the sort of the longest history that I know about of use of psilocybin and hanging mushrooms is in Mexico. So they have cultures kind of around it. And again, I talked about the Aztecs, so that's where they around. But the anthropology and the history is like this whole other rich area that it's not been my primary focus of study. But if you email me, then I'll try to send you some resources because there are people out there who specialize in that. But the sort of kind of...
Yeah, you made us refer to other people, but the mushroom ape theory, where do you stand on that, or would you refer us to someone else?
That's just speculatory. So Terrence McKenna had a lot of really interesting ideas. One of them was that the world was going to end in 2012. In accordance with his Aztec calendar, my calendar, I'm sorry. But, and I'm friends with his brother. We just talked together not long ago. But yeah, he had what he called the stone ape theory, which is that use of these kinds of psychedelics, like psilocybin mushrooms, may have kind of spawned the development of language and thinking as we know it among kind of Neanderthals and stuff. And we can't really test that. It's a hypothesis, but it's certainly possible. But going back to like the three historical periods of psychedelics, there was, again, this kind of history of indigenous use, and Western kind of science had gotten some inkling and understanding of this, again, mostly from an anthropological standpoint. Until the middle of the 20th century, though, we really didn't know too much about these, and this is Dr. Albert Hoffman, who in 1938 synthesized LSD, and in 1943, it was sitting on a shelf for several years. He accidentally ingested some and got the effects and said, "Whoa, what was that?" It's literally, it was, we're coming up on the date because it was April 16th, 1943. So it's just a few days from now. It's actually widely celebrated in psychedelic culture as Bicycle Day because he basically was at his lab. He took some by accident. He was so intoxicated that he had to ride home on his bicycle and say, "I can't work anymore." And that was when we discovered that LSD had these really profound consciousness-altering effects. And it's extremely potent, one of the most potent drugs that we know of, actually. So we measured some micrograms, which is millions of grams, whereas most of the drugs that you take, medications, are milligrams or thousands of grams. So he's a really important figure for Western scientific understanding of these psychedelic compounds. He also was the first to isolate psilocybin from the mushroom as a chemist. He's a hardcore scientist and also an important figure that I'll come back to. He died not too long ago at the ripe old age of 102. But that kind of brought us into the modern era of psychedelics as we know it. And this is actually, sorry for blurriness, but from a 1965 CBS documentary called The Spring Grove Experiment. So the Spring Grove Experiment was about research that was being done here in the Baltimore area, in Kingsville actually, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s using LSD and similar compounds like glycosyltryptamine or DPT. And actually this is one of the studies that I think is my favorite from their group. They were working for over a decade with these psychedelics. Here what they did is they took what they call narcotic addicts from the Baltimore area. These were incarcerated men who were basically addicted to heroin in the Baltimore area in the late 60s and early 70s. And they either gave them LSD with therapy or they put them in a kind of what they call treatment as usual control group And you can see that there's obviously a big difference in the proportion of people who stayed abstinent from heroin and opioids after their LSD treatment, as opposed to this other control group. And so, this is a really, I think, important study, especially considering the current opioid epidemic. Although we have not gotten back to do this type of research yet, and I hope it's soon that it does happen. But yeah, Spring Grove, this is part of the reason why I named the talk past Baltimore and beyond, because Baltimore has been a hub of psychedelic research for a long time, which is interesting. And right now it's kind of undergoing this renaissance here, but all over the world. And just speaking of this early phase of research, so this was the second kind of phase of psychedelics that really started with Hopkins' discovery in the 1940s through the 50s and 60s. And there's a lot of research. This is a bunch of research showing basically that treatment of alcoholism using LSD worked better than non-LSD control conditions.
Can I just ask, when you talk about treatment with LSD, or you just said, is it just basically giving patients a measured dose of LSD on a periodic basis, or is there some other aspect of that treatment?
I'll explain more about that in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
But no, it's not just what we call a pharmacological effect. We do most of the work that we do in combination with therapy. And that's one of the unique things that is about these types of drugs, that seems to really help focus their effects in a therapeutic manner. And so that's actually kind of part of what happened next is, for about a couple of decades, this was pretty quiet. This research was happening in scientific laboratories and nobody really knew much about it except for scientists. And then it started to get out of the lab. And then there was obviously this countercultural movement in the 60s, hippies, and there was a lot of stuff going on politically, as I understand it. I wasn't there, but the anti-Vietnam, war protests, civil rights movement, women's rights, like all this stuff was kind of fermenting at the time in the 1960s. And at the same time, LSD was kind of becoming this drug that was a part of this. And so there was actually a really big backlash just a little bit after Woodstock, actually. So in Woodstock in 1969, you have basically the war on drugs starting in 1970 or so, under the direction of then President Richard Nixon. And the idea at the time was public enemy number one is drug abuse. And so they were upset about cannabis, they were upset about psychedelics, and I think more so, as we've learned more recently about the people who are using these drugs, basically being a thorn in the side of the political establishment. And so by criminalizing these drugs, they basically made it very difficult for people to continue doing research. It still happened for some time until about 1976 or so, but it was kind of becoming more and more frowned upon. And so it was something that was the beginning of the end for psychedelics for some time. And this is just kind of a quick quote. This is former President Obama's idea about the war on drugs, basically that it's not been very successful. I would agree personally. So I'm sure, we talked, somebody mentioned Michael Pollan's book, which came out last year. Kind of interesting because this was actually the impetus for that. So in 2012, he wrote this piece for the New Yorker, which is called the Trip Treatment. And so he interviewed some of the volunteers from the Hopkins group who were cancer patients who had psilocybin. He interviewed some others from some of the similar studies, and he got really interested. I don't think he'd really used a lot of psychedelics, as I understand it. And talking to these people who had transformative experiences, he just went all in and spent the next 5 years or so just researching the area, interviewing a lot of people who were experts, interviewing people who went through this. And so it ended up kind of, if you will, reawakening this area. Now, the group that I've been working with at Hopkins has been doing this research since 2000. There was earlier work happening in the 90s, but it was on a very limited scale. And so starting in 2012, though, you're starting to see more and more interest in questions like this. This is, I think, from Time Magazine. Do LSD and magic mushrooms have a place in medicine? And so that's the sort of background, and I think this is what I call the third period, which is of psychedelics, which is after the 70s. There was very limited, there was recreational use of course, but there was limited science until at least the 90s, and really most of the bigger scale science didn't start until the 2000s. And Hopkins has played a big role in that, and like I said, our lab is just down the street here. But we conducted 10 studies with psilocybin, different types of folks. Given psilocybin to more than 320 people, and this is the last time I counted, which was a few months ago. So the spring, by comparison, the Spring Grove group that I talked about was doing work in the 60s and 70s. They treated a little over 700 people with LSD and similar compounds. So we've done, we're halfway there. We've done over 600 psilocybin sessions at our lab on the road. We currently have a team of more than 12 researchers, psychologists like myself, psychiatrists, pharmacologists, neuroscientists, and clinicians, research coordinators. So we have a lot of folks. And this is just our lab. There's also groups that, most notably Zurich, I think does, in my opinion, some of the best work that's out there. There's also a group in London that does a lot of interesting imaging work. Groups at NYU and UCLA and Madison, and groups in Spain and Brazil. So there's lots of, this is kind of multiplying as we go.
Could you raise the projector up a little bit so it shines higher on the ceiling? Because I think people in the back can't see the bottom third of the screen very well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is just a picture of me and some of the folks I was working with when I got there in 2012. You can tell I'm a little younger there, maybe a little bit more idealistic at the time. And then this is Matt Johnson, who's been my primary mentor, and Roland Griffiths. You can't see her, but that's Mary Casamano and Maggie Findens, who have helped us do a lot of this research. Mary has done, I think, more psilocybin sessions than almost anybody else out there. So this is the group when I got there in 2012 for reference. This is us now in 2019, and this is still not all of us, this is just many of us there. And again, we're growing, and we hope to continue to see that grow more. So some of the research that we've done kind of started with Roland Griffiths and the team doing research in healthy normal. So we start with healthy normal people and see what happens when you give them the drug. And then you go from there, depending on what the drug effects are, and that helps to shape the next line of research. And so we started with the healthy volunteers, looking at effects on personality in healthy people, and then started saying, well, what we found in these healthy people suggests this could be helpful for people with issues like addiction, or depression, or end-of-life anxiety. So we've been moving in that direction. And we're currently doing studies in religious professionals, so priests, rabbis, monks, nuns, to understand sort of spiritual impact, meditators, and some of the new studies that we'll be starting this year, working with folks who have early Alzheimer's disease and anorexia nervosa. So we're trying to kind of see what other areas we can use these psilocybin specifically for. So when we do drug sessions, we are not just administering the drug. We spend usually about a month preparing people to get the drug. That would include about 8 hours worth of intensive counseling with people who are trained to administer psilocybin like myself and folks on the team. So those two monitors are usually there for the whole drug session, but they're there for the whole prep as well. And the thing is, to your question before, this is not like, aspirin, take 2 and call me in the morning. This is the drug, psilocybin and LSD and mescaline. They usually last anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. The effects can be very intense, and if you're not ready, well prepared for them, then it can really dig up a lot of stuff that can be difficult to deal with. And so we want to make sure it's people who are trained there that you're comfortable with, and that you go through all of the contingencies for what can happen before the drug is administered.
Who might get into this? I'm just curious, what kind of doses are you administering during these sessions?
So we're using typically, and so we did research kind of to figure out what the sweet spot was. And again, about being rolling Griffiths in the team before I got there actually. But what they found was that this kind of sweet spot is in between 20 and 30 milligrams body weight adjusted dose. It's unclear if that's still necessary. So a bigger guy like me would get a higher dose than somebody who's maybe more petite and not quite as heavy. But that's 20 to 30 milligrams is kind of our sweet spot. And in terms of like how much, actual sweet mushrooms would that be like? It would be anywhere from an 8 to a quarter, or maybe a little bit more than that. So it can be kind of anywhere from 3 or 4 to maybe 6 or 7 grams or more on the high end. So it's a lot. Yeah, we use high doses on purpose though, because it seems to have the best kind of sticking power and long-lasting effects if you want to like beat an addiction, for instance.
So we're treating, for the program Kids Building, they were treating addicts, was basically administering the drug, monitoring them for any negative side effects, but basically just getting them exposed to the drug. There wasn't any like conversation involved or any activity other than.
There are different schools of thought on this, and the school that we prescribe to is what is kind of called the psychedelic therapy school, where basically the work is happening between the drug and the person, and the people who are there are just there to make sure that the person is safe. You need to have a good relationship with them to help them in case they hit a rough patch, but we don't usually intervene during the high dose drug effects. And the main thing that's happening is people are laying on a couch and they're listening to music. They have an eye mask on so that they're not looking at stuff, their eyes are covered. And we just tell them to trust, let go, and be open. So it's really what we call a non-directive approach. And so this is what it kind of looks like in practice.
And what do they experience? I mean, are they?
So, I've done over 80 sessions in the lab in the last 7 years, and some of those are with the same person over and over again, because each experience is different. Each person is different. It's very unique. That's why this idea of psychedelic as a term to describe the drugs was important, because it's quote-unquote mind manifesting. So it's whatever's in your mind is going to be manifested or come out, and that's going to be different than what's in his mind.
So is it a lot going back to past experience in life, or?
I'll send you a paper, but basically there are what we call maybe 5 broad classes of types of experiences, and they're broken down into different types of phenomenology, as we call it. But basically what happens for the person. And that's a very kind of crude map, but it could be anything from what we call autobiographical content, meaning going back to past memories and experiences, to mystical types of experiences, to challenging experiences, and anything in between. So there's a lot of, again, literally any type of content that you can think of in your mind, or imagine, or have in a dream state, is something that can come up. And so the content is so varied.
So the psilocin that you're administering, is it synthesized, extracted from the mushrooms, or the raw mushroom itself?
So just to make it easier, we use psilocybin that's made in the lab by a chemist. And that way it's just one pure chemical, and we know the dose. And we can also tell the FDA and the DEA and everybody who's monitoring us what we're giving people and where it came from. And it came from Dr. Dave Nichols, who's a chemist at Purdue. But yeah, so most of the experiences though, people are here, or most of the sessions people are here laying like this, again, listening to music really, and most of the work is done before and after, as for me as a sort of counselor or therapist, and the work that's happening in the session is kind of, if you will, the inner healing kind of drive of the person. And so if we know that you have an issue, maybe something that was unresolved, then it might come up during the session, but it's not something that we're necessarily trying to drive toward. And so, going back to these early studies of healthy normals, just trying to figure out what are the effects of psilocybin. What we found was that versus a control drug, this is methylphenidate, also known as Ritalin, which is a stimulant drug for ADHD. People have these very profound mystical types of experiences. What does that mean? It means they feel like they're at one with everything. It feels like a sacred experience to them. Feels like they have some sense of what ultimate reality they're knowing. It's indescribable. They kind of feel like they're outside of normal time and space. And they also feel usually deeply felt positive mood. So So this is a specific type of experience that we see often with people when they have these high doses, these mystical types of experiences. And what we found is that these types of experiences are the ones that tend to lead to a lot of the benefits down the line. The interesting thing too is that these experiences, although they're really profound when they happen, they continue to be considered very important and impactful even 2 months later. And so you can see these folks here are talking about, this is methylphenidate or the control condition. How different is your life satisfaction after this experience? And there's no change in methylphenidate for most of these guys. And for most of these folks after psilocybin, they're saying that they've had some moderate increase in their life satisfaction since the experience. And again, this is 2 months later. We asked spouses, close friends, co-workers, how did Bob seem since he was in this experiment? And again, methylphenidate seems about the same to me. Psilocybin, 2 months later, he's been different. He's more patient. He yells less at the kids, or he's more easygoing in work meetings. So this is our way of trying to corroborate that it's not just in the person's mind, but other people are also reporting similar things. And even more interesting, this is us following up with the same folks 14 months after their drug experiences. And you can see, there's very little what we call decay in this effect. People are still rating it as one of these very, very highly meaningful, spiritually significant experiences, even over a year later. And so that's unusual in pharmacology because usually if you take a drug, the effects last to all the drugs in your body, you get rid of it and the effects are gone. And with psilocybin, you see the effects lasting 5 months or even over a year. Similarly, we found that people who had these kinds of mystical types of experience, feelings of oneness with everything, were having changes in their personality. So personality develops and changes over time, but we usually think of it as stable, more or less after our 20s or mid-20s. But one of the domains of personality is what's called openness to experience. And one of the papers that went back to these healthy normal volunteers and looked at changes before and after psilocybin was finding that the people who had these complete mystical experiences were having significant increases after the fact in their openness to experiences. And that's actually, we think of it as a good thing because openness includes aesthetic appreciation of beautiful phenomena in nature, music, art, also includes imagination and fantasy life. Also, tolerance of others' viewpoints. So if that guy sitting over there doesn't necessarily agree with you, you are a little bit more open to saying, well, okay, maybe we disagree, but I can see that there's another side to this, which obviously in these kinds of very divisive political times can be useful and important. There's a dark side to the psychedelics, and I don't like to talk about all the good stuff, but really the dark side is that people have sometimes what we call these challenging experiences, also colloquially known as bad trips. In one of these studies where we had 18 people, 7 of them, when they got this higher dose, had these feelings of extreme fear of insanity, feeling trapped. We did this is unpredictable in terms of when it comes on. This is a course of about 6 hours after the drug, and you can see some people had it earlier, some people had it in the middle, some later. Some of them lasted a long time, some of them lasted a short time. So,
did they have a mask on the whole time?
Usually when these really challenging effects come on, typically people will take them off so we can try to talk them through it.
Okay. And
So they can't take it off.
does that kind of immediately help?
A little bit, because if you're seeing horrible visions, then,
Right.
it can help to get out and see familiar faces. We typically fill the room with pictures of loved ones or of the person when they were younger and things that are supposed to be like happy and comforting. So yeah. We do a lot of online surveys to ask people, because we can only bring so many people in and give them psilocybin, for instance. It's time consuming and expensive. But lots of people take it out in the world, and so we like to ask them about their experience. And so this is a study of 2,000 people who told us about their very most challenging experience using psilocybin. And what they told us was that their most challenging bad trip was either among the top 5 or single most difficult experience of their life. So these can be really psychologically challenging. Also, what they told us is that for many of these people, they found that their life satisfaction and well-being increased as a result of their experience, or they felt that their experience actually gave them something positive to walk away with. And so again, that is really congruent with what we see in the lab. And there are people who said, that they had decreases in their well-being. And, we don't typically see that in the lab, and I think it's due to careful screening and preparation. So, all of these effects in healthy normals really prompted us to look at how can we use this clinically with people who have different kinds of conditions that could perhaps benefit from these types of experiences. One of those groups is cancer patients, people who have a cancer diagnosis. If we know that could basically end your life, it can be very anxiety-provoking, it can be depressing. And, this is one of the bigger studies that we've done in a clinical population. It's double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, or not placebo-controlled, but there was a control condition. So people either got a high dose, like we talked about, or a very low dose, one that's so low that you wouldn't even notice it. And what you're seeing is here in red, the people's depression and anxiety after that high dose, and that's 6 months afterwards, it's still staying low, that depression and anxiety. And you can see with the counseling, and the low dose or the control condition, there's some improvement, but it's not nearly the same. And then these people crossed over and got the high dose, and then it comes down. So it really is suggested that it's the high dose of psilocybin in combination with the counseling that is doing this, having these beneficial effects. And you can see that these people are, again, these are the low dose versus the high dose. They're having substantially different outcomes.
I'm sorry, are you saying that for every patient they got both like a microdose and a really high dose, and you just split which one they got first?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So that's what we call within dose or within subjects design, and it's a kind of way to maximize a small number of people. And so you flip a coin and you either get the low dose first, or placebo first, or high dose first, and then you can see, if one, what happens. And that's what we did with this study. This is findings from a group at NYU, New York University. They do the same type of thing with patients with cancer and depression and anxiety, and found basically the same thing, except for they followed them out for 9 months afterwards and found that, again, after a single administration 9 months later, people are still having significantly decreased depression and anxiety. This is from a group in London with a small group of folks with treatment-resistant depression. That's what we call people who don't respond to typical antidepressants like Prozac or Effexor or Celexa. And you can see that their depression starts here, and after a single dose, a high dose of psilocybin, it drops and then kind of stays about half of where it started from, which is pretty impressive. This is the individual trajectories of each person, so you can see some people have better or worse outcomes. And we're starting to understand more about how this works in the brain, because in the first wave of research in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have all this cool neuroimaging stuff that we can do now in terms of fMRI, PET, looking at what's going on in the brain in real time. So we're starting to do that, and we're starting to tease apart mechanisms. So for instance, in these depressed patients in London, changes in amygdala activity after psilocybin administration predicted better outcomes in terms of less depression 5 weeks down the line. So by blunting or changing the amygdala reactivity, you're seeing more antidepressant effects. So that gives us a little bit of a clue of what happens in the brain of people in terms of getting these good results. I mentioned, we do online surveys. One of the areas that we focus on in our lab and that I'm particularly interested in is using psychedelics to treat addiction. And there's been research on psychedelics for opioid addiction, for alcohol problems, and even for tobacco addiction, more recently, which I've been working on. This was an online survey of about 830 people. All of them said, again, these are people out in the real world who said, I had some sort of substance use problem. I took a psychedelic recreationally, and then I had this change in my relationship with the drug that's a problem. And so you can see that's true of alcohol, cannabis, opioids, and stimulants, which would include methamphetamine or cocaine. And so, for instance, if you just zero in on these alcohol folks, on average, they said they were drinking about 25 drinks a week, and that after they had this experience, they were drinking less than 5 drinks a week. So a pretty significant drop. You know, again, in terms of teasing out what are the mechanisms, we asked about times when they tried to kick the habit previously versus times when it happened after psychedelic use, and found that some of these what we call physiological withdrawal symptoms were about the same. At least that's how they judged them. Some of them were much less pronounced or much less severe. You can't see here, I think it got cut off, but craving is one of the main ones that they said after their psychedelic experience, their craving for the drug was much less. And also things like anxiety and depression. So this would be consistent with
Is that with therapy also?
So these folks didn't have any therapy. These folks are taking psychedelics out in the world. This is again 800 people who just you know, said that they took psychedelics and this is what happened.
Is that on top of going changing that study had no change?
Exactly.
Not creating something.
Yeah, so again, they're changing appetite, heart rate, drowsiness, fever rates were about the same when they tried to kick the habit using other means as when they tried to kick the habit, or when they had a change in their drug use as attributed to the psychedelics. So again, this was the physiological stuff seemed to stay the same. What we think of some of these, particularly irritability, anxiety, depression, and craving, which we think of as more psychological, really seem to be blunted. So again, this is sort of pointing at a mechanism that we are interested in. Also interesting to hear the people's first-hand accounts. What did they have to say? This person said that, I felt very connected to all nature and life around me. I felt a great sense of harmony with the whole planet. I was able to retain the memory of this feeling, which was very helpful to me in the weeks after. I felt less anxious and less need to drink to enjoy myself. And you get similar types of stories from folks who said they kicked other habits. For cannabis, there was a period of deep introspection and self-analysis. Eventually came the realization we're all capable of changing our lives if we take that first step. I decided to move on permanently. So again, this seems to generate some sort of insight, some different perspective, and then that helps to, again, create a behavior change. Lab study from the University of New Mexico and people with alcohol problems showing that therapy plus psilocybin led to decreased drinking. Again, this lasts 9 months after you administer psilocybin once or twice. And then this is the work that I've been doing for the last 7 years with people who are trying to quit smoking. And you can see this is from our initial pilot study with 15 smokers who tried and not been able to quit multiple times. And we see here is at intake, when they started, they're over this cutoff, meaning that they've been smoking and all these people said they wanted to stop. And you can see all these people after their first psilocybin session and through a long-term follow-up, no longer positive for smoking. Some of them didn't quit, a minority. Some of them relapsed, but again, as a minority. The majority of people, so 80% of them quit and stayed quit through their 6-month follow-up. And through a year, 67%, and more than 2.5 years later, 60% were still abstinent. So that's really good rates, where typically you'd see between 15 and 25% down the line of a year.
So have you been able to get any insight into the mechanism of the change? In other words, is it because the psychedelics help them to resolve things that were source of emotional pain, or that it interfered with the reward mechanism from the addiction? Or, do you have any sense of what actually driving it?
There's a combination of things that seems to be really complicated, and it seems to involve some of the stuff you mentioned. There's brain stuff, which I'm going to get to. There's also, in terms of changing the activity of different parts of the brain that are involved in addiction. There's also psychological stuff in terms of resolving perhaps trauma or unresolved past material. So it seems to be a combination. But we're still trying to get under the hood, and that's what all this you know, all this brain imaging stuff is about, so we can get that understanding better. We're in the middle of running a randomized controlled trial. So the first study is 15 smokers. We're running now an 80 smoker study. Half of them are getting patch counseling, half of them are getting psilocybin counseling. That study is still in the midst of being conducted by me and others. But what you can see here is just even after psilocybin, you're seeing that there's a significantly greater reduction in craving for tobacco after the psilocybin. So again, it kind of points to a mechanism. And we're again trying to understand where that resides and how it works in the brain. We also find psychologically that greater personal meaning and basically mystical type effects of the experience. So the more oneness you feel with everything, the better your long-term prognosis is. And that's similar to what has been found with ketamine. And even though these drugs work differently in the brain, there is some overlap in terms of the glutamate and the way that that might be basically affecting what we call BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which causes growth of new synapses in parts of our brain cells. So this is a kind of, again, mechanistic story that we're starting to piece together in terms of what are the nuts and bolts. And this is, you know, what they're calling the psychoplastigenic effect of the psychedelics, that they actually cause our brain cells to go from this to this. It looks like it's getting a little hairier, but what it's doing is building new connections. And other research with animals, like this one here, is showing actually neurogenesis, so birth of new brain cells after administration of psychedelics. So we think that, again, from a brain standpoint, that this is probably what's happening, which could lead to some of these therapeutic effects. And you know, here again, this is a very nice graphic that's been often shared, that when you put a person in the brain scanner under the influence of placebo or nothing and psilocybin, you're seeing these very different patterns of communication between the different brain areas. So these are the different areas of the brain around the end here. And this is usually how they're talking when you're sober. And this is how they're talking to each other when you're on psilocybin. And so it's, you know, different patterns of activation in the brain from a mechanistic standpoint. From a psychological standpoint, this can look quite different from person to person.
Have you done any analysis of other side impacts? Like, for example, does it have any effect on intelligence? Does it have any effect on problem-solving capability? Or
there's work in that area. There's been work suggesting greater creative problem-solving. Not intelligence per se, we haven't done it. That has been examined. Personality is the closest that we've looked at and found a significant effect so far. But we're starting to look at those other areas as well. But, you know, again, what we're finding though is that the drugs like psilocybin and LSD can alter your sense of what's meaningful, can alter your sense of what is self and what is other, social cognition. It can kind of create a dreamlike state. I like this one a lot. This is my friend Rainer, Switzerland uses this paper, but basically as you get more loss of self-boundaries and loss of cognitive control this way, on this axis, under the influence of LSD, you also get higher what they call, quote-unquote, bizarreness density of imagery. So this is, again, this is something used to measure dreams, but you get more unusual dreamlike imagery, which, again, the psychedelic state is often likened to dreaming. And this is another interesting paper. We didn't do this, but basically took thousands of people's descriptions of their dreams and thousands of people's descriptions of drug use. And these are all the different drugs lined up. And here's where the psychedelics fall in terms of their likeliness to the dream state. And so you can see LSD and these guys have the highest similarity to the descriptions of dreams. And these guys over here, including barbiturates or basically downers, are lowest similar to dreams. So, we're looking at this from a lot of different angles. We're also trying to understand some of those things that you mentioned in terms of altruism, spirituality, meaning in life, forgiveness, and finding that yes, psilocybin can have a positive impact on those types of things. And not only psilocybin, but social support also helps. And so this is, I think, the biggest study on psilocybin has been published, period. 75 people, they're broken up into 25, 25, and 25. These guys got the low or placebo dose. These guys got the high dose with our normal counseling regimen. And these guys got the high dose with normal counseling, plus they had a support group, kind of like they would meet up once a week and talk about their experiences. These were all healthy people who wanted to learn to meditate. And what we see here is that there's this nice orderly effect of the people who got the low dose and just regular counseling didn't really see much of a change in their life meaning. These guys got a little bit of a boost in terms of their change and their meaning in life. And the guys who got the most support, who had the group to talk to about their experience, got more than just the psilocybin and the counseling.
How come there wasn't a low dose, high support?
Just researchers are really the 75. This study already took, I think 8 years to finish. So, you know, in terms of what we're able to do with the limited resources that we have, this was about as, you know, as big as we were able to go. But that would have been good. That would have been a true kind of square in terms of getting everybody in the right condition.
Is Big Pharma taking an interest in doing their own studies?
It's hard and complicated because these are naturally occurring substances. They can't be patented, or it's difficult to really find a way to patent them. And so, no, they haven't been. And also, this would be disrupting a lot of what's out there in terms of if you were going to take Chantix to quit smoking, you'd be taking the same drug every day for 3 months. Whereas if you took psilocybin, you'd come in for 3 months of therapy, but take it maybe a couple of times.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of research they could get shut down real quick, you know.
There are so many ways that we can get shut down that it's scary. And you know, I didn't, when I got here in 2012, I was kind of but now I'm much more cautious. And you know, I work with this guy, Roland Griffiths, who's been there for 20 years doing this, and this is, you know, part of his life's work, and so we're very careful there for that.
Is there anything research that's related to affect something with autism or Asperger's?
I actually just talked to Vice about that for an article. I'll send you that link. There was, Gary Fisher did work with children with autism in the 70s in LSD. And then there's also my friend Alicia Danforth at UCLA just did a study with people with high functioning autism spectrum disorder with MDMA. So it's a different drug, but it works similarly, finding very positive effects in terms of reducing their social anxiety. So yes.
You had a slide that had the circles with all the different colors, and one was the placebo and one was, I guess, after the psilocybin. How long does it take for it to go back to normal, or does it not ever?
We don't know that answer to that. So what they do is they put the person in the scanner when they're under the influence, and that's what we've taken a video of, if you will. We're starting to take videos of the next day, and we're finding that there's differences the next day. And research I'm working on now, we're taking videos of the brain, you know, in real time 3 months later. And so we're trying to answer that.
That'd be interesting to find out.
Oh yeah. But I mean, my guess would be there's changes that go on because we're seeing changes in personality. And so that should be, you know, correlated with the brain. So going back to our smokers, this is, you know, some of the folks that we work with, and we ask them what was most memorable. This was, I think, a year after their experience. You know, what was most memorable to you about the experience? And you can just look at these people never met each other. They never really had any association whatsoever. But what, you know, if you look at them here, 405 said, "Change is what I believe. We're all one and divine." The next person said, "The awareness that all is one, the realization I'm an integral piece of that one's puzzle." The next person, oneness with the universe. So there's this kind of common theme in the community. And you know, I think that that's, again, what we think of as one of the primary mechanisms psychologically. And I've also tried to talk about this as a sort of inverse PTSD or an inverse trauma. Because when you explain this to medical folks, it's difficult for them to understand these big changes that happen so quickly and that last so long. But trauma is like that. It just happens in the opposite direction. So when you have a very traumatic experience, some people develop PTSD and they can be damaged for perhaps the rest of their life. And I think that these kinds of experiences of oneness that can be induced by psychedelics and other methods can be like an inverse PTSD, where a single discrete event can have these positive reverberating effects that are ongoing for people. Future directions, there's cluster headaches, obsessive compulsive disorder. Like I said, we're doing a study on Alzheimer's patients, eating disorders. Combining this with virtual reality and augmented reality is something that I want to do soon. Doing group psychedelic therapy, understanding the role of culture. So would this work the same in all different kinds of people?
Are these all Hopkins European studies or just ideas?
So these are ideas, and actually these two studies are being started right now at Yale in Connecticut. These two studies are being started right now at Hopkins. This one, if somebody gives me $1 million, I'll start that one really soon. we did buy a VR helmet, so we're working on it. And then this stuff is, these are other questions that we have. And speaking of the cultural stuff, I want to be sensitive to the fact that there's a long history of indigenous use. There's people like shamans who have been using these types of plants and substances for a long time. And then there's a lot of scientists, Western scientists who showed up and got interested, which is great. But it can create like this place where it can be a clash, or what I actually hope will be more of a cooperative kind of endeavor, where we can try to learn what they understand about these substances and their use, and likewise we can also try to help them, and we can all work together. Because I don't like the idea of medicalization, like pharmaceutical type stuff, sort of co-opting all of this, where there's obviously, again, a long and rich history and tradition of use from other cultures, including, our Mexican heritage. And so these types of people have been using this stuff for a long time.
So a little bit difficult for me to figure out how to phrase this, but maybe it's kind of just part of the question.
Yeah.
There's a big gap between scientific language and more esoteric spiritual language describing these experiences.
Yeah.
So when you're speaking in this context, how are you trying to bridge that gap when someone's saying, oh, when you encountered a demon versus, oh, when you are having a trying, challenging psychological experience?
That's a good question, and I think this is what I'm trying to point to here, is that there's different understandings of the world, different kind of cosmologies, epistemologies, ontologies, what's out there, what's real, and how we understand things. And I don't, again, I'm not a fan of there kind of being this one, this is the way things are, this is what's real, and everything else is kind of barbarism, or just, people don't, they're just dumb or they're primitive. I think that we might be talking different languages, but there could be a good way that we can learn from each other and try to figure out what's the overlap there when you're talking in spiritual language and this is shamanic traditions, and when you're talking about psychological and spiritual stuff, and that we can learn and enrich all of those different schools of thought by kind of sitting down at a table and talking together, instead of kind of being like, we know everything and everybody else doesn't. So,
yeah. I need to have someone help me understand what kind of society we are if we will allow and make legal alcohol, which clearly alters the same kinds of drugs. It's a drug, it kills people, people die. Nicotine kills people, people die. And this one, we have ample evidence, because people have been using it for so many years, that people don't die. And that there are lots of good things about it. I don't understand why you are being forced to do this very rigid structure to try to get this drug. Just give it to somebody who wants it. I don't get it.
It's complicated. I mean, and again, that's part of why I brought up Nixon and the drug war. And I think there's more to it than that, and it's really complicated. But there I think is a fear of what these types of drugs and experiences could bring.
But fear, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, we have a scientific basis for the deaths for alcohol, the deaths from nicotine. There's no fear there.
Yeah, well, people aren't rational. People are emotionally driven, unfortunately.
Well, I guess the short response to her question is that it's a fear of the dominance of one's paradigm over what already exists. But my question to you is, if you could, or I'm wondering if you could speak to the exchange of information across these lines, because like obviously the findings amongst these Amazon leaders are not being recorded in the same way that your findings have been recorded. So I'm wondering how that happened.
Well, you know, we were working towards kind of more interchange, but there's lots of anthropologists and social scientists who are going to try to study this phenomenon of use and misuse, and I think there's more exchange now. But yeah, it's still not in a systemic way, and so that's something that needs to be addressed. I'm almost done with the slides, so I think we'll get to the questions after I get to the end here. I mean, and so part of your question also is pharmaceutical is a multi-billion-dollar industry, lots of money there, and so I think there's, again, vested interest in suppressing this stuff. And for instance, if you talk about cannabis, you can look at some of the industries that have spent money to try to keep cannabis illegal, and that would include for-profit prisons, that would include alcohol. So, you know, there's people who make a lot of money, millions or billions of dollars, who might not want to see this kind of thing get out in the world. And then there's also people who are scared. And, you know, if you tell somebody that, oh, this will make you go crazy, or this will make you do something nuts like jump out a window, you know, and you're scared that your kids are going to take it, then...
They do that with alcohol right now.
Sure.
And peanut butter. Peanut butter kills people.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I wanted to just end on a positive note. Instead, I know I've talked a little about some of the more difficult aspects of all this. But again, this is going back to Albert Hoffman. Again, a shout out to other psychedelic Albert. But this, you know, is something he, again, died at 102. He said, I share a belief from many of my contemporaries that spiritual crisis pervading all spheres of Western industrial society can be remedied only by a change in our worldview. We have to shift from the materialistic, dualistic belief that people and their environment are separate toward a new consciousness of an all-encompassing reality which embraces the experiencing ego, a reality in which people feel their oneness with nature and all of creation. And so, again, I think this is what psychedelics kind of point the way towards, and hopefully, you know, that's something that will be developed again with the work as it gets a little bit more widespread. But here is my email address. If you have any questions, please email me. I'll have some literature and information. This is just some of the people that we work with. I'll start from here. This is all of our participants who, if they didn't come to our lab and do all this crazy stuff that we asked them to do, we wouldn't be having anything to tell you about. And these are all the folks who help us do our work.